Canada, 2010. Part 1. The Solace of Solitude. Ethan was no stranger to the harsh realities of life. The once warm and lively home he had known as a child had gradually transformed into a battleground. His parents, once deeply in love, now seemed to communicate only through shouts and bitter arguments. Their financial troubles had become a dark cloud that loomed over the family, casting a shadow on everything. Ethan could feel the tension in the air the moment he stepped through the front door, the heavy silence that followed each argument more oppressive than the shouting itself. The small Canadian town where they lived was picturesque, with its snow-covered streets, quaint shops, and friendly neighbors. But for Ethan, the charm of the town had faded long ago. He walked through the streets like a ghost, unnoticed and disconnected from the life around him. School was no better. The hallways echoed with the laughter and chatter of classmates who seemed to exist in a world separate from his own. He felt invisible, a feeling that had only intensified as his parents' fights became more frequent and more intense. Ethan had always been a quiet, introspective boy, but as his home life deteriorated, he retreated further into himself. He spent hours in his room, seeking refuge in books and music, anything that could drown out the noise of his parents' arguments. The Bible his grandmother had given him became a constant companion, its pages worn from the countless times he had turned to it for comfort. The verses spoke to him in a way nothing else could, offering a sense of peace that was otherwise absent from his life. The only time Ethan felt truly at ease was during his visits to St. Mary's Hospital. The sterile smell of antiseptic and the steady hum of medical equipment might have been unsettling to others, but for Ethan, the hospital was a place of solace. It was here that his Uncle Jack lay in a coma, a condition that had persisted for 6 long months. Despite his uncle's unresponsive state, Ethan visited him every day after school, pouring out his heart in the quiet room that had become a sanctuary from the chaos of home. The hospital room was small but comfortable, with a single window that overlooked the town's main square. The view from the window was always the same: people bustling about their day, unaware of the young boy sitting by the bedside of a man who had once been so full of life. Uncle Jack had been Ethan's hero growing up, a man with an infectious laugh and a zest for life that had always brightened Ethan's darkest days. Now, Jack lay motionless, his chest rising and falling with the rhythm of the ventilator, his once vibrant eyes closed to the world. Ethan would sit by the bed, sometimes for hours, talking to his uncle about everything and nothing. He spoke of his parents' fights, his struggles at school, and the loneliness that had become his constant companion. He confessed his fears and doubts, the questions he was too afraid to voice anywhere else. And though his uncle never responded, Ethan found comfort in the act of speaking, in the belief that somewhere, deep inside, his uncle could hear him. When Ethan wasn't at the hospital, he sought solace in the woods that surrounded his town. The dense forests, with their towering trees and winding paths, offered a refuge from the world that seemed to be closing in on him. He would walk for hours, losing himself in the stillness of the woods, the only sounds being the crunch of leaves underfoot and the occasional rustle of wildlife. His favorite spot was a secluded area near Lake Serenity, a place where the water was so clear it reflected the sky like a mirror. The lake had always been a source of comfort for Ethan, a place where he could escape the turmoil of his life and find a moment of peace. He would sit by the water's edge, the Bible resting on his lap, and read passages that spoke of hope and redemption. The words resonated with him, offering a glimmer of light in the darkness that surrounded him. Yet, despite the comfort the Bible provided, there was a part of Ethan that longed for something more. A sign, a voice, something tangible to hold on to in his time of need. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in shades of pink and orange, Ethan felt a wave of despair wash over him. The weight of his parents' arguments, the loneliness that had become his constant companion, and the fear of losing the only person who had ever truly understood him all came crashing down at once. Kneeling by the lake, his hands clasped tightly around the Bible, Ethan prayed with a desperation he had never felt before. "God, I need to hear you," he whispered, his voice breaking with emotion. "I need to know you're there, that you're listening. Please speak to me, not just in my heart, but in a way I can hear. I don't know how much more of this I can take." As the last light of day faded from the sky, leaving the world bathed in twilight, Ethan remained by the lake, waiting for a sign, a voice, something, anything that would offer him the strength to keep going. The night was silent, save for the gentle lapping of the water against the shore, and as the stars began to appear one by one in the sky above, Ethan finally stood, feeling no less burdened than before. Little did he know, this night would mark the beginning of a journey that would change his life forever. A journey that would test his faith, challenge his understanding of the world, and ultimately bring him closer to the peace he so desperately sought. Part 2. A Voice Through the Veil. The next day dawned like any other, the Canadian winter casting a pale light over the town as the sun struggled to break through the thick clouds. Ethan moved through his morning routine in a daze, the weight of his unanswered prayer heavy on his heart. He went to school, where the hours seemed to blur together, and then made his usual pilgrimage to St. Mary's Hospital, hoping that perhaps today would bring some sense of clarity or relief. The hospital was quiet, as it often was in the late afternoon. The hallways were lined with the same muted green walls, and the smell of antiseptic lingered in the air. Nurses moved about with quiet efficiency, their faces a blend of weariness and calm, used to the steady rhythm of life and death that played out within these walls. Ethan walked slowly, his footsteps echoing down the corridor as he approached the room where his uncle lay. The room was exactly as he had left it the day before. Small, sterile, with a single window that let in the dim light of the overcast sky. Uncle Jack lay in his usual position, his chest rising and falling with the steady rhythm of the ventilator. The machines that surrounded him beeped softly, the only signs of life in the otherwise still room. Ethan pulled up a chair beside the bed, as he had done so many times before, and began to speak. His words were soft, almost hesitant, as if he were unsure whether they would be heard. He spoke of his day, of the cold that seemed to seep into his bones and the loneliness that had become his constant companion. He talked about his parents' latest argument, the way they had hurled hurtful words at each other, leaving him feeling more isolated than ever. As he spoke, Ethan's voice grew quieter, the weight of his emotions pressing down on him. He looked at his uncle, at the man who had always been his rock, and for the first time, he felt a wave of hopelessness wash over him. What was the point of all this talking if there was never going to be an answer? He was alone in this room, as he was alone in his life, and no amount of words could change that. Tears welled up in Ethan's eyes, and he squeezed them shut, trying to hold back the sobs that threatened to escape. He felt so small, so insignificant, lost in a world that seemed determined to break him down. He had prayed for a sign, for something to show him that he wasn't alone, but all he had received was silence. And then, just as he was about to give in to the despair that had been gnawing at him for months, something extraordinary happened. A voice, soft but clear, filled the room. "Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted." Ethan's eyes snapped open, his breath catching in his throat. The voice was unmistakably his uncle's, but it was different, deeper, more resonant, as if it carried with it a power that Ethan had never heard before. He stared at his uncle's face, but nothing had changed. Jack's eyes were still closed, his body still unmoving, but the words continued to flow, verses from the Bible that Ethan knew well. "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, a mix of fear and awe filling him. He wanted to speak, to ask how this was possible, but the words were caught in his throat. The voice, however, seemed to know his thoughts, addressing his doubts and fears with a calm authority that left no room for disbelief. "Do not be afraid, for I am with you. Do not be dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you and help you. I will uphold you with my righteous right hand." Tears streamed down Ethan's face as he listened, each verse touching on the deepest parts of his pain and fear. It was as if the words were a balm for his soul, soothing the wounds that had festered for so long. The voice, though coming from his uncle, felt as though it was coming from somewhere beyond, somewhere higher. "Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways submit to him, and he will make your paths straight." The room seemed to glow with a soft, warm light, and for the first time in a long while, Ethan felt something other than despair. He felt hope, a fragile, flickering hope, but hope nonetheless. The voice spoke to him as if it knew him, understood him, and loved him in a way that was beyond human comprehension. When the voice finally fell silent, the room returned to its previous state, the soft beeping of the machines the only sound. Ethan sat in stunned silence, his mind reeling from what he had just experienced. He looked at his uncle, who remained in his coma, unchanged, but Ethan knew that something profound had happened. This was not just a random occurrence, not just a figment of his imagination. This was an answer, a sign that his prayers had been heard, that he was not alone. The despair that had gripped him for so long began to loosen its hold, replaced by a tentative but growing faith. Ethan stayed by his uncle's side for hours, replaying the words in his mind, trying to make sense of what had happened. But no matter how much he thought about it, one thing remained clear. This was a moment of divine intervention, a moment where the veil between heaven and earth had been lifted, if only for a short time. When Ethan finally left the hospital that evening, the world outside seemed different. The cold air no longer felt oppressive, and the darkness no longer seemed so all-encompassing. He walked home with a new sense of purpose, a new resolve. He didn't have all the answers, but he had been given something far more valuable. The knowledge that he was not alone, that there was a higher power watching over him, guiding him. As he reached his house, the familiar sounds of his parents arguing reached his ears, but this time they did not fill him with dread. Instead, he felt a sense of calm wash over him. He knew that the road ahead would still be difficult, that there would still be challenges to face, but he also knew that he was not facing them alone. Ethan looked up at the sky, where the stars were beginning to twinkle in the fading light. "Thank you," he whispered, his breath forming a small cloud in the cold air. "Thank you for listening to me." And with that, he stepped inside, ready to face whatever came next. Part 3. Healing Words. After the extraordinary experience at the hospital, Ethan felt a profound change within himself. The despair that had once weighed him down seemed to lift, replaced by a newfound sense of purpose and clarity. He returned to school the next day, carrying with him the words he had heard through his uncle, a message that felt as though it had come directly from God. Ethan walked through the hallways of his school with a quiet confidence that he hadn't felt in years. The usual hum of conversations and laughter buzzed around him, but for the first time, he didn't feel like an outsider. The harsh glares and whispers that once made him shrink into himself now seemed insignificant. The school, with its long corridors and rows of lockers, felt less like a maze designed to trap him and more like a place where he could make a difference. His first class was history, a subject he had always enjoyed but never excelled at. As the teacher droned on about the significance of the world wars, Ethan found himself drifting into thought, his mind replaying the verses that had been spoken through his uncle. "Do not be afraid, for I am with you," the voice had said, and those words resonated deeply within him. The teacher called on him suddenly, asking a question about the Treaty of Versailles. Normally, Ethan would have mumbled an incoherent answer, hoping to avoid further attention. But today was different. He answered confidently, surprising not only himself but also his classmates, who were used to him being quiet and withdrawn. The teacher nodded approvingly, and Ethan felt a small surge of pride. During lunch, Ethan found a secluded spot under a large oak tree in the schoolyard, a place where he could think and reflect. He opened his Bible, turning to passages that he had read countless times but now saw with new eyes. As he read, a group of students passed by, their voices carrying the usual mix of jokes and gossip. Ethan looked up briefly, catching the eye of a boy named Ryan, who was known for his sharp wit and even sharper tongue. To Ethan's surprise, Ryan approached him, followed by a couple of others. "What's that you're reading?" Ryan asked, nodding towards the Bible in Ethan's hands. His tone wasn't mocking, but curious. Ethan hesitated for a moment before replying. "It's the Bible," he said simply. "It helps me when things get tough." Ryan raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. "You really believe in all that stuff?" Ethan met his gaze steadily. "I do. It's helped me a lot, especially recently." The others exchanged glances, and Ethan could see the skepticism in their eyes, but he also saw something else, a flicker of interest, perhaps even a bit of respect. Ryan didn't say anything more, just gave a slight nod and walked away, leaving Ethan alone with his thoughts once again. Over the next few days, Ethan noticed small changes in the way his classmates interacted with him. The usual taunts and teasing seemed to diminish, replaced by cautious curiosity. A few students even started sitting with him during lunch, drawn by the calm and quiet confidence that Ethan now exuded. He spoke little, but when he did, his words were thoughtful and measured, often quoting the verses that had brought him so much comfort. One afternoon, while walking home from school, Ethan was approached by a girl named Sarah. She was someone Ethan had barely spoken to before, but he knew her as one of the more popular students, always surrounded by friends. She seemed nervous, her usual bright demeanor subdued. "Hey, Ethan," she said, falling into step beside him. "Can I ask you something?" Ethan nodded, curious. "I've seen you reading that Bible," Sarah began, glancing at the book in his hand. Well, I've been going through some stuff lately. My parents have been fighting a lot, and I just don't know what to do. I guess I was wondering if you had any advice." Ethan's heart ached at the familiar pain in her voice. He had never expected someone like Sarah to come to him for help, but he realized that the changes within him were becoming visible to others. He thought back to the words spoken through his uncle, the comfort they had brought him, and knew exactly what to say. "Would you mind if I shared something with you?" Ethan asked, his voice gentle. Sarah nodded, her eyes hopeful. "There's a verse that's helped me a lot," Ethan said, flipping through the pages of his Bible until he found what he was looking for. "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." It's a reminder that you don't have to carry everything on your own. Sometimes, just knowing that someone else is there for you, listening, can make all the difference. Sarah listened intently, her eyes filling with tears. "Thank you, Ethan," she whispered. "I really needed to hear that." Ethan smiled, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. It wasn't just the act of helping someone that mattered. It was the realization that his own struggles, his own journey, could be a source of strength for others. He had been given a gift, a voice that could bring comfort and hope, and he knew he had to use it. As the days turned into weeks, Ethan found himself becoming more involved in the lives of those around him. He began attending a small youth group at his local church, where he shared his experiences and listened to the stories of others. The group quickly became a second family to him, a place where he could speak openly about his faith and the challenges he had faced. At home, the tension between his parents was still present, but Ethan could feel a shift happening. He started sharing the insights and verses he had learned with his mother, who listened quietly, her usual stern expression softening. His father, though more reserved, seemed to appreciate the moments of calm that Ethan's words brought into the house. One evening, as the family sat down for dinner, Ethan noticed a new dynamic at the table. The usual undercurrent of hostility was absent, replaced by a tentative, almost fragile peace. His parents spoke to each other in tones that were softer, more measured, and Ethan knew that the words he had shared were starting to take root. In the quiet moments before bed, Ethan would reflect on the changes in his life, the way his world had shifted from one of darkness and despair to one of light and hope. The words spoken through his uncle had become a guiding force in his life, leading him not only to heal himself but to reach out and heal others as well. And yet, despite all the positive changes, there was still one thing that weighed on Ethan's heart, the fact that his uncle remained in a coma. The voice had brought him so much comfort, had given him the strength to transform his life, but Uncle Jack's condition hadn't changed. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that there was more he needed to do, that his journey wasn't complete. It was a thought that lingered in the back of his mind, even as he continued to move forward, helping those around him and slowly bringing his family back together. He had found purpose and direction, but the question of how to help his uncle remained, a puzzle that he knew he would eventually have to solve. But for now, Ethan was content to take things one day at a time, trusting that the answers would come when the time was right. The road ahead was still long, but he no longer walked it alone. And that made all the difference. Part 4. A Question of Faith. The hospital at night took on a different character, one that Ethan had come to know intimately over the past months. The hallways, which bustled with activity during the day, now lay in eerie silence, the soft glow of the fluorescent lights casting long, ghostly shadows. The usual sounds of life, conversations, the clatter of carts, the shuffle of nurses' shoes, were replaced by the steady hum of machines and the occasional distant murmur of voices. It was in this quiet, almost sacred stillness that Ethan found himself spending more and more time, particularly at his uncle's bedside. Uncle Jack's room was on the hospital's third floor, at the end of a long corridor that always seemed just a bit darker than the others. The room itself was small, with white walls that reflected the cold, artificial light of the overhead fixture. A single window looked out over the parking lot, its view obscured by the condensation that formed on the glass each night. Inside, the space was dominated by the hospital bed where Jack lay, surrounded by the equipment that kept his body alive while his mind wandered in some distant, unreachable place. Ethan had taken to visiting his uncle late at night, long after most visitors had left. There was something about the solitude of these late-night vigils that gave him a sense of peace, a feeling that here, in the stillness, he could think more clearly, pray more deeply. The daytime visits were filled with distractions, the nurses coming in and out, the distant sounds of life continuing beyond the hospital walls. But at night, it was just him, his uncle, and the soft, rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor. On this particular night, the air outside was cold and still, the kind of night where even the slightest sound seemed to carry for miles. The moon, almost full, cast a pale light through the window, mingling with the artificial glow of the room and creating an ethereal atmosphere. Ethan sat in his usual chair beside the bed, the Bible resting on his lap, his fingers absently tracing the worn edges of the pages. He had read so many passages, so many verses that had brought him comfort, but tonight something felt different. A restlessness stirred within him, a feeling that had been growing over the past few weeks, ever since that first time he had heard his uncle's voice recite scripture. He had shared those words with others, had seen the impact they had, but still there was something unresolved, something that gnawed at the edges of his newfound peace. Ethan looked at his uncle, the man who had always been larger than life, now lying so still, so quiet. Jack's face, once so full of expression, was serene but lifeless, his body unmoving except for the steady rise and fall of his chest. It was hard to reconcile this image with the man Ethan had known, the man who had taken him fishing on summer mornings, who had told him stories of adventures in the wilds of Canada, who had always seemed invincible. He felt a wave of emotion rise up in him, a mixture of sadness, frustration, and a deep, aching longing for something he couldn't quite name. The voice that had spoken through Jack had brought him so much, had given him hope and purpose, but it had also left him with questions that he hadn't dared to ask before now. Why him? Ethan whispered into the stillness, his voice barely audible over the hum of the machines. Why does he have to stay like this? He's done so much good in his life, helped so many people. Why can't he wake up? The room, of course, offered no response, only the quiet beeping of the heart monitor and the soft whoosh of the ventilator. But Ethan wasn't asking for a response. Not from the room, at least. He was asking God, the one he had prayed to so fervently, the one who had answered him in ways he had never expected. For a long time, Ethan sat in silence, his thoughts a tangled mess of doubts and fears. He had come to believe that there was a reason for everything, that God had a plan, but tonight that belief was tested. He had seen so much change for the better in his life. His parents had started to communicate, his school life had improved, and he had even made friends. But the one thing he wanted most, the one thing he prayed for every day, remained unchanged. His uncle still lay there, trapped in a world Ethan couldn't reach. As the minutes ticked by, the restlessness within him grew. It wasn't just about his uncle's condition. It was about everything. His faith, his purpose, the path he was on. He had come so far, had learned so much, but now he felt lost, as if he had reached a crossroads and didn't know which way to turn. In his heart, he knew he needed to pray, to seek guidance, but the words wouldn't come. It was as if the doubt had silenced his prayers before they even formed, leaving him feeling more alone than ever. But then, as he sat there in the silence, something shifted. It was subtle at first, just a feeling, a warmth that began to spread through him, starting at his chest and radiating outwards. It was the same feeling he had experienced that first night by the lake, the night he had prayed for God to speak to him. It was a sense of being held, of being surrounded by something so much greater than himself, something that transcended the pain and the doubts. Ethan closed his eyes, allowing the feeling to wash over him, and slowly, the words he had been searching for began to come. "Lord," he whispered, his voice trembling with emotion, "I don't understand why this is happening. I don't understand why he has to stay like this. But I trust you. I trust that you have a plan, that there's a reason for all of this. Please, show me what I need to do. Show me how I can help him." The warmth grew, filling him with a sense of peace he hadn't felt in weeks. And then, just as before, the words came, not from his uncle this time, but from somewhere deep within him, a voice that was both familiar and otherworldly. "Pray, believing you have already received." The words resonated within him, clear and undeniable. They were simple, yet profound, a call to action that he couldn't ignore. "Pray, believing you have already received." It was a challenge, a test of his faith, but it was also an answer, the answer he had been seeking. Ethan opened his eyes, his heart pounding with a mix of fear and hope. Could it really be that simple? Could his prayers, if filled with true faith, be enough to bring his uncle back? He knew what he had to do. Slowly, Ethan rose from his chair and knelt beside the bed, his hands clasped together in front of him. The room was silent, save for the rhythmic beeping of the machines, but Ethan felt a presence there with him, a presence that filled the room with a light that was both seen and unseen. He took a deep breath, steadying himself, and then he began to pray. But this time it was different. This time he prayed not with doubt or desperation, but with a quiet, unshakable belief that his prayers were already answered, that the outcome was already known. "Lord," he began, his voice strong and steady, "I thank you for hearing me. I thank you for the miracle that has already taken place, for the healing that has already begun. I know that you have the power to do all things, and I believe with all my heart that you are at work here, in this room, in this moment." As he prayed, Ethan felt the warmth within him grow, felt the presence surrounding him like a protective embrace. He continued, his words flowing freely, each one filled with the conviction that what he was asking for had already been given. "Thank you for my uncle's life, for the man he is, and for the man he will continue to be. Thank you for the healing that is taking place right now, for the strength that is returning to his body, for the light that is filling his mind. I believe, Lord, I believe that he will wake up, that he will be whole again, because you have already made it so." The room seemed to glow with a soft, warm light, and Ethan could feel the power of his words, could feel the truth in them. He prayed for what felt like hours, his voice unwavering, his faith unshakable. And as he prayed, he felt a peace settle over him, a peace that told him everything was going to be okay. Finally, exhausted but filled with a deep sense of fulfillment, Ethan finished his prayer. He remained kneeling by the bed, his head bowed, his eyes closed, letting the silence wash over him. And then, in that silence, he felt it, a gentle touch on his shoulder, a sensation so soft, so subtle, that for a moment he thought he had imagined it. But when the touch came again, more insistent this time, Ethan opened his eyes, his heart leaping in his chest. A voice, warm and familiar, broke the silence. "Why are you kneeling there on the floor?" Ethan looked up, his breath catching in his throat. Standing beside the bed, smiling down at him with eyes full of life and love, was Uncle Jack. For a moment, Ethan could only stare, his mind struggling to comprehend what he was seeing. But then, the reality of the situation hit him with full force, and the overwhelming joy and relief that coursed through him was indescribable. Uncle Jack was awake, truly awake, his face full of warmth and the vitality that had been missing for so long. Ethan's vision blurred with tears, and before he could speak, Jack knelt down beside him and pulled him into a tight embrace. They stayed like that for what felt like an eternity, holding on to each other, the room filled with the soft hum of the machines that had once been a lifeline but were now just a reminder of the miracle that had taken place. Jack finally pulled back, looking at Ethan with a smile that was both gentle and filled with understanding. "You did it," he said softly, his voice steady and clear. "You believed." Ethan could only nod, the lump in his throat making it impossible to speak. He had believed, truly, deeply, and completely. And now, here was his proof standing right in front of him, alive and well. The joy that had begun in that moment spread quickly, radiating out from that small hospital room and touching everyone who heard the news. The doctors were stunned, the nurses overcome with emotion, and the small town that had known so much pain and hardship was suddenly filled with a sense of hope and wonder. Ethan's parents, who had come to the hospital the moment they heard, embraced each other and their son with a warmth and unity that had been missing for so long. The arguments, the tension, all seemed to fade away in the light of this miracle. They were a family again, bound together by the love and faith that had seen them through their darkest hours. As the days passed, Jack regained his strength, his recovery swift and sure. The story of his miraculous awakening spread throughout the town, inspiring others to believe in the power of faith, the strength of prayer, and the possibility of miracles. And as for Ethan, he knew that his life had been forever changed. The boy who had once felt so lost, so alone, had found his purpose, his place in the world. He had been given a gift, one that he knew he would carry with him for the rest of his life. A gift of faith, of hope, and of a love that transcended anything he had ever known. In the end, the question that had once plagued him, why, no longer needed an answer. He had learned that some things were beyond understanding, that some miracles were simply meant to be accepted, to be cherished, and to be shared. And so, Ethan continued to walk the path that had been laid before him, guided by the light that had shone through the darkest of nights, knowing that he was never alone, that he was always held in the hands of a love far greater than he could ever imagine. Part 5. A New Dawn. The weeks that followed Uncle Jack's miraculous awakening were a time of joy and renewal for Ethan and his family. The once cold and tension-filled home that Ethan had known was now warm and inviting, filled with laughter, conversation, and a sense of peace that had been absent for so long. The dining table, once a place of silence and unspoken resentment, was now a place where the family gathered each evening, sharing stories, memories, and most importantly, their hopes for the future. Jack had returned to his old self remarkably quickly, his strength and vitality restored as if the months in a coma had never happened. He spoke often of the time he spent away, though he couldn't recall specific details. What he did remember was a profound sense of peace, and he credited Ethan's unwavering faith for his return. The bond between uncle and nephew had deepened in ways neither could fully express, but both understood that they had shared something sacred, something that went beyond words. Ethan's parents, once locked in a cycle of conflict and misunderstanding, found themselves rediscovering the love that had brought them together in the first place. They began attending counseling, not as a last resort, but as a way to build on the progress they had made. They laughed more, fought less, and slowly but surely, they were knitting their family back together. The town, too, seemed to be touched by the miracle. Word of Jack's recovery spread quickly, and soon, people were coming to the family for advice, for prayer, or simply to hear the story firsthand. Ethan found himself at the center of this new community, a role he accepted with humility and grace. He knew that he was just a vessel, that the true power lay in the faith and love that had guided him through the darkest of times. One evening, as the sun set behind the hills, casting a golden light over the town, the family gathered for a special dinner. The table was set with care, the food prepared with love, and as they sat down together, the air was filled with the scent of roast chicken and fresh bread. It was a simple meal, but to Ethan, it was the most meaningful he had ever shared. As they ate, they talked about the future, about Jack's plans to return to his work in the community, about Ethan's growing role in the church, and about the family's plans to take a long-overdue vacation to the mountains. There was a sense of anticipation in the air, a feeling that they were on the cusp of something new and wonderful. After dinner, they moved to the living room, where a fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm glow over the room. They sat together, sharing stories, laughing at old jokes, and simply enjoying each other's company. Ethan looked around at the faces of those he loved, his parents now closer than ever, his uncle alive and well, and the friends who had become family. He felt a deep, abiding sense of gratitude for everything that had led them to this moment. As the evening wore on, The conversation turned to the future. Jack spoke of the projects he wanted to start, the ways he hoped to give back to the community that had supported him through his ordeal. Ethan's parents talked about their plans to renew their vows, to make a fresh start together. And Ethan, with a quiet smile, shared his desire to continue his work in the church, to help others find the same faith and hope that had carried him through his darkest days. The night ended with a prayer, led by Ethan, who had become the spiritual heart of the family. As he spoke, his voice steady and sure, he thanked God for the miracles they had experienced, for the love that had brought them together, and for the future that lay ahead, bright with promise. When the prayer ended, they all sat in silence for a moment, the only sound the crackling of the fire. Then Jack, his voice soft but filled with emotion, said, "We've been through a lot, but I believe the best is yet to come." Ethan looked at his uncle, at the man who had been his hero, and now his partner in faith. "I believe that too," he said quietly. And as the fire burned low, casting long shadows on the walls, the family sat together, united in a way they had never been before, ready to face whatever the future held with love, faith, and the unshakable belief that they were never truly alone. The long night of their trials had passed, and now a new dawn was breaking, filled with hope, love, and the promise of a brighter tomorrow. If this story moved you, please leave a comment below to share your thoughts and experiences. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, God bless you.